Before I begin, I first want to let y'all know that this is part B of part 6 of the Extensive Reflection Project. If you have not seen part A, definitely watch it first since I'll be directly going off of it here. Thank you and enjoy the rest of part 6. And with that, December 2019 is wrapped up and we can finally move on to 2020. This year can be described in one simple but powerful word: crazy. This year was so wild, crazy, and was so crazy that it's going to appear in future history books because of just how insane this year was. And I don't mean crazy or insane in a good way, as this year was crazy and wild in a bad way. I think most people would agree with me when I say that 2020 was by far the worst year of the 21st century, as it was a truly god-awful year filled with some terrible events. However, the start of the year was definitely more relaxed in terms of on the global scale. However, since January 2020 marked the beginning of the spring 2020 semester, that meant that this year started off quite hectic for me since that meant new classes and new schedules. So let's talk about my new schedule for the semester with regard to the high school classes. So for the record, English, crew, and seminar stayed the same. However, I did begin a new high school class, that being biology, which was taught by the Earth Environmental Science teacher. So biology is the science class 10th graders take during the spring semester, as this class, like World Lit, has an end-of-course exam that goes along with it. It's also the science class that pretty much the majority of 10th graders in North Carolina take, so once we were done with this class, we wouldn't be behind in science compared to the traditional high schoolers. This class would serve as my new 4th block, meaning it replaced the time spent in the technology guy's room. As for my teacher, while she was great at teaching and made the class fun, she had to have been by far the most unfair teacher I think I ever had. How was she unfair? Well, it all comes down to the due dates for assignments, more specifically, due times. For online assignments, every teacher and professor I had up to this point would make stuff due at 11:59. However, my biology teacher apparently didn't get the memo, as she would make stuff due at really random times. Some assignments would be due at 8 AM, some might be due at 2:30, and then some might be due at 11:59. Hell, she'd even make some stuff due at 2 AM. This fucked with me on so many goddamn levels because I would of course decide to do an assignment or something on a particular night, only for me to realize that it was actually due earlier that day. And the worst part is that she accepted absolutely no late work, meaning even if you were a minute late, you'd get a 0. It would be one thing if she made stuff due at the time different from 11:59, but make everything else due at the same time, but no, she decided to be completely inconsistent with times and ended up fucking me and the class over. She'd also never tell us when certain stuff would be due, causing me and many others to rack up zeros on stuff because, well, we didn't realize that shit was due earlier in the day. And sure, maybe I and the others should have paid more attention to the online platform and the times, but she's literally the only teacher I've ever had that's made stuff due at completely inconsistent times. Every other teacher and professor I had would make stuff due either always at 11:59 or at another time and remind us of the time it was due. And they realized that most stuff is due at midnight. So as painful as it is for me to say, my biology teacher was hands down the most unfair teacher I ever had at early college, and the only teacher I had at early college that I did not like at all. She did leave a year afterwards, and she would end up being replaced by a super familiar face from part 4 who I'll touch on again in part 8. Anyways, I'll talk about my new college classes later. For now, let's talk about the 3rd intensive we did this school year. So unlike the Blowing Rock intensive, this intensive involved us staying at school. It would, however, last 2 full days, those being Monday, January 6th and Tuesday, January 7th, the days we got back from Christmas break. So for this intensive, we focus on healthy choices. So things like eating healthy, exercising, staying away from drugs, that shit. So this intensive started off with every other intensive, being the mystery piece. So we started with the mystery piece itself, which was an animated video of what a potential future might be if we didn't care about our health and all decided to turn into Reddit mods. In it, people were so fat that they had to use machines to get around, had automated fast food dispensers, and so much other stuff that screamed laziness. After we jotted our notices and wonders from the video, we did the gallery walk, where there were a multitude of health-related photos and articles. After jotting down the notices and wonders from these, we reviewed the common piece. I've since completely forgotten what the common piece was, so I can't comment on it. Then we were told what the intensive would be about, being of course healthy choices. It was after that when we dove into the expert files, so they did them a little bit differently this intensive. The teacher split us into groups and told us that we had 10 minutes to become an expert on the expert files we were provided. So me and the group I was assigned to was just given an article about exercise. We jotted down some notes on it, and once the 10 minutes were up, we had to tell everyone what we had gathered. So we did ours and that was that. However, this exercise ended up making our teachers look really dumb. You see, once we were all done, our teachers explained that the next day, we were going to have some experts come to our school to talk about healthy choices. And after mentioning this, our teachers talked about what an expert is, where they mentioned that an expert is someone who spends years studying a particular topic. This immediately turned everyone off, as just a little while ago, they told us that we had 10 minutes to become an expert on a certain article about a particular issue. So then, which was it, 10 minutes or 10 years? Our teachers for sure could have done a much better job explaining this. But after all that, we were then split into 3 groups, where we toured around 3 different stations. For my group, our first station was with the technology guy. So outside of course working with the technology and leading a crew of his own, our technology guy also worked as a fitness instructor at a local gym, as he happened to be a bodybuilder. Therefore, he knew some stuff about exercising and the importance of it. So for this station, we did some exercises. Well, we only did 2. We first started with planks. For it, we simply had to try to hold a plank for as long as possible. Our English teacher also joined us in these exercises that she co-taught the station. Ultimately, most people dropped out pretty quickly, usually only getting to between 1 to 2 minutes. In fact, after around 2 minutes, there were only 2 people left, me and our English teacher. This kind of surprised me since it had been nearly a year since I quit swimming, and at this point, I didn't really exercise regularly, but I was able to hold a plank for a longer time than the others. However, I ended up giving in at around the 3-minute mark, so as I couldn't continue, leaving our English teacher as the winner since she managed to give up 30 seconds later. Then for the second exercise, we did wall sits. Contrary to planks, our English teacher was not good at these, as she only was able to do around 2.5 minutes. Then the second to last person did after 4 minutes, leaving me again as the only student still doing them, where I managed to hold on for an entire 5 minutes before giving up. Again, this is definitely surprising since I wasn't physically active, but still cool nonetheless. After that, we went to our next station, which was with our seminar teacher. For it, he taught us how to calculate BMI and how to use it as a measure of health. At the time, I was around 5'5" and weighed 140, giving me a BMI of 22. I've since only grown 2 inches, but I've gained about 10 pounds, putting my current BMI at around 23.5. The last station we did was with our biology teacher. However, I don't remember at all what we did here, so I'll skip over this one. Then for the end of the day, we ended off by doing an exercise about caloric intake. So for it, we were split into groups of 5. In each group, one person would have to taste 6 different liquids and make 2 lists, one sorting how much sugar they thought was in the liquid, and another for how much sodium they thought was in the liquid. I can't remember the exact liquid since I wasn't the one who tasted them, but I believe the liquids included milk, Coca-Cola, Diet Coke, orange juice, and water. And there's one more, but I'm not really too sure what it was. I think it might have been root beer, but I'm not really too sure. Then the next day, January 7th, they brought in some experts. Honestly, I don't remember any of these experts beside ones who talked about vaping, but other than him, I don't remember any of them. But what I do remember from this day was the introduction of our intensive project. So of course, being a major intensive like the Blowing Rock intensive, our Healthy Choices intensive also had a project that went along with it. As for what our project was, we had to write a children's book about healthy choices. Then in April, we were going to go to a local elementary school to read our books to 2nd and 3rd graders. Now at first, I was very scared about this, as in addition to writing a book for children, we also had to include pictures. After all, pretty much every children's book includes pictures in it, since kids are going to focus a whole lot more on the pictures than the words. And with me being the worst artist on the planet as I am, I got really scared about this. Luckily, we didn't write these books by ourselves, as we wrote these books in groups of 2. Our teachers assigned us a partner to work with. I just so happened to get super lucky and be paired up with a very artistic girl. It also made things super easy by the fact that she pretty much let me control the whole project. And while I did make most of the decisions regarding the book, I would always ask her if she was fine with them to make sure I wasn't completely dominating. Now, the first decision I made about the book is that me and her would have different roles. I would be the author and she would be the illustrator, which worked out great for the both of us since I preferred to exclusively write while she preferred to just draw. So we did that. Our teachers wanted each partner to do both tasks, but given that I excel in writing and she excels in art, it was glaring that we should just stick to our own stuff. Now, being the writer, I also pretty much made all the decisions on what the book would be about, its plot, and the title. I decided to write this book about exercise and even some references to the expert file we read during the intensive. With that, I named the book Let's Get Strong. Now, for the plot, it's basically about a family of 3 bears, a papa bear, a mama bear, and a baby bear. At the beginning of the book, the baby bear feels bad about herself for feeling weak, but then she's encouraged by her parents to get stronger. Over the next few years, she does just that, and through exercising regularly and eventually becomes super strong. This strength comes in very helpful down the line when a human hunter is passing through and attempts to slaughter her whole family. The baby bear, who's now very strong, comes in and scares the shit out of the hunter, who gets exposed for being super weak. The baby bear then encouraged him to get stronger and exercise regularly, and everyone lived happily ever after. Now, sure, maybe the hunter possessing a rifle might have been too graphic, but this is about as kid-friendly as I was gonna get. If this was in my normal writing, I probably would have ended it with the baby bear mauling down the hunter, since if you've read The Charm, you know my writings are not for the faint of heart. Nonetheless, the plot was good enough, and especially for a children's book since they obviously can't read books with more complicated plots. I wrote the story sometime in late January, and my partner would soon begin working on the artwork. Ultimately, we would never finish this book, and I'll explain why when we get to March. Alright, so let's talk about English. So during this month, we began our new unit. Again, I forgot what specifically it was on, but all I remember from it was the actual text we wrote. That being the play from it was the actual we read, not wrote. Let's rewind that. Again, I forgot what specifically it was on, but all I remember from it was the actual text we read, that being the play Cyrano de Bergerac. This play takes place during 1640s France, and it follows the life of a man named Cyrano who has a crush on his, stepsister? The fuck is this? A historical fiction play or the script to a goddamn Pornhub video? Alabama moments aside, she turns him down because of his big nose, as Cyrano notably has a massive nose. However, he's very good with words, so he helps a very attractive man who sucks at words get the girl. Honestly, this is a very confusing play to read since the plot was kind of all over the place. It was still better than Things Fall Apart, but it was quite a mess and honestly not that good of a read. However, we only read 2 acts of this play. I think we were running low on time, so our teacher just let us watch the movie for the rest of the 2 acts. The movie was in French since this play was written in French, but it had English subtitles so that we could read. But in addition to Cyrano, we also watched a movie that takes direct inspiration from this play. This movie, titled Roxanne, is basically like if Cyrano took place in 1980s Vancouver, British Columbia, as opposed to 1640s Paris. It follows the same plot with the main character, whose name is not Cyrano, going after some girl, only to get friend-zoned for his big-ass nose. But of course he gets another guy to win her and all that. The movie had a much better plot than Cyrano and was more relatable too since it of course took place 300 years later. I'll touch more on both Cyrano and Roxanne in February, as we would do 2 projects related to these pieces in. For now, I want to introduce my new college courses. So the first class I'll talk about was my new 8-week Monday through Thursday class, being Political Science 120, which is American government. This class went over the basics of the US government, from how the founding documents were created to what the Constitution entails to the rights granted from the Constitution. I pretty much knew all this stuff already, so this is a super forgettable class. The professor herself would also be forgettable. I recall that she worked as a magistrate full-time, but other than that, I don't recall too much about her. Moving on, let's talk about Math 171, which is pre-calculus algebra. This class is often called college algebra at most universities, but since it had the word pre-calc in it, I'll just refer to this class as pre-calc. I'd actually take a second pre-calc class during junior year called pre-calculus trigonometry that of course focused on trig, but I'll call that class trig when I get to part 7 to avoid confusion. Anyways, this is our first real college math class. Quantitative literacy was more of an intro to college math class. This was the first real one. For it, we went over algebraic techniques that we might see in a calculus class, as calculus uses a lot of algebra. This class met on Mondays and Wednesdays from 9:45 to 11 in a building on the other side of the community college campus. Therefore, my English teacher would let me and the others who had this class out 15 minutes early so we can make it over there. As for the professor, she was very weird, as she graded the actual work you did to arrive at your answer, not your answer itself. I didn't like this format when I was taking this class since, well, I could do a lot of stuff in my head. As a result, I'd get a lot of points taken off for not showing all the work on assignments, tests, and other stuff. I would, however, have her again for that trig class I mentioned, and as we're going to see then, I'd enjoy her format a lot more then. Nonetheless, she was a good teacher and did well with the class. Now on Tuesdays, Thursdays, and Fridays, we of course did not have class. Therefore, we would have a study hall during these periods. Just like 4th block back from the fall semester, absolutely nothing got done during this time, as we all engage in some really stupid shit, and there would be a lot of funny moments in this particular class in February that I'll touch on then. Now, the third class I'll touch on, of course, the Friday class. This was Criminal Justice 141, which was Corrections. This is a class on the US correctional system, how it works, and the issues it faces. Like Intro to Criminal Justice, it was not a class I selected since our Friday courses were elective classes. I just so happened to be given it because my first selections were all taken. This class met on Fridays from 9 to 11:15 in the same building that we had Intro to Criminal Justice in. As for my professor, she just might have been the single worst professor I had at early college. Now, I will give her some slack since it was her very first semester teaching, but holy shit, she did some stuff that not even first year professors should do. One of the biggest is using a completely different book than what we as students had. Now, our school provided the books for us since we didn't have to pay for them. However, our professor selected to use a completely different book. This might not seem like a big deal since they were written by the same authors, but her book had completely different information and statistics from ours, causing chapter quizzes and exams to be super obnoxious because there was no fucking way to prepare for them, and she didn't bother uploading PowerPoint slides or notes with information from her book, making these quizzes and exams all the more BS since I literally had to Google everything, and that was hard since a good portion of the statistics would be behind a paywall. Now you're probably wondering why I'm talking about statistics and what I mean by that. Well, basically, our quiz and exam questions weren't questions like, what type of system is this? No, they'd be like, what percentage of people incarcerated are between the ages of 18 to 25? And of course the percentages would be completely different from our book than the professor's. Hell, a lot of the time, our book didn't even have these percentages. They were exclusively from the professor's book. So there was no consistent way to get good at this class because our professor just couldn't use the same book as us or even provide other resources to get these statistics. But in addition, she'd pull an extremely dick move that at the very end of the semester that I'll discuss in May that I think just might have been the most outrageous and most bullshit thing I've ever seen a professor do. So yeah, fuck this professor. Most students surprisingly loved her because she was very young and could relate to us, but I hated her guts because she made this class super unfair and completely full of shit. So those were the 3 classes I was taking at the time. I'd of course start with another class in March once American government wrapped up, but for now, these are my new classes. So now let's talk a little bit about seminar. So throughout the month, we of course worked on our children's book. We were doing quite well and were able to make some steady progress. That was until something sinister happened with our seminar teacher. So it started on Tuesday, January 28th. It started off as a normal day until while me and my friends were walking to our study hall, we witnessed our seminar teacher bolting out his door and running outside the school. Me and my friends were quite interested, as he obviously never ran off, especially only an hour into the school day. Our teacher would end up being the talk of the school for the rest of the day because you just don't see a teacher doing that. That day in seminar, we joined one of the other 10th grade seminars. During this time, we were supposed to be working on our book, but nobody made any progress on it because, well, we were talking about our seminar teacher and how we bolted out the door. We just knew something was strange about it, but we couldn't figure out why. However, the following day at school, Wednesday, January 29th, I learned the real reason. So before we were let out of class, we hung out in the multi-purpose room, where I always went to sit with my friends before going to class. However, the moment I sat down, Lucas said, "Zach, we don't have a math teacher anymore." I was shocked and asked why. That was when Lucas showed me a picture of our seminar teacher's mugshot. But if our teacher being arrested wasn't already crazy enough, the reason he was arrested was even crazier. As it turned out, our teacher was a pedophile, so for the last month or two, he had been on Grindr and met this 15-year-old boy who went to the high school I did driver's ed at. They had spent time talking with, and my teacher even sent this boy nude photos. They eventually set up a time for the two of them to meet up to have sex. Thankfully, the boy's father went through his phone, saw the messages and grooming, and contacted the authorities, who were able to arrest our teacher. Ultimately, our teacher was charged with 1 count of indecent liberties with the child and booked into the county jail on a $25,000 bond, which his parents paid the following day. He also quote-unquote resigned, although I'm 100% sure our principal fired him because people like him are the very last people who should be working around minors. He would also stop working with the youth at church, meaning the middle school boys small group would hang out with us high school guys for small groups. But funnily enough, my church was actually more concerned with him being gay than him being a pedophile, as in their official statement, they mentioned that church leaders should not commit acts that contradict scripture. Because he committed the sin of homosexuality, we have made the difficult decision to dismiss him of his duties within the church. Yeah, no wonder why this church is of the same denomination that tried to cover up thousands of sexual abuse allegations. Fuck that church. Now, in previous story times, I expressed feeling bad for him because I thought he didn't know that the boy was 15. However, after digging into the case a little bit, it turns out that he actually did know that this kid was 15, as that's why he was charged. Yes, this grown-ass man, who was 27 at the time of the incident, was knowingly messaging and sexting a 15-year-old boy. That's fucking disgusting. Now, sure, that boy should not be using Grindr because it and every other dating app has a strict requirement that you must be at least 18 years old or over. But that doesn't excuse my teacher's actions since he knew this boy was underage. However, if I told you his name, you would not find him on the sex offender registry. The reason is because the DA decided to drop the charge against him because that boy was on Grindr underage, meaning our teacher's lawyer would have been able to defend it very easily and likely would have won, so he unfortunately did not face any legal consequences. However, he did face consequences related to his reputation and job duties. For one, this case went on the news the night he was arrested, so everyone knew his name and the disgusting shit he did. And two, he of course lost his job, his role at the church, and was banned from volunteering at the local YMCA, which he often did once a week. So yeah, that's the story of how my teacher got arrested and became the face of by far the biggest controversy at our school. As a result, literally everyone at the entire school was talking about him all day at school. Every time one of my friends came in, I'd show them a picture of his mugshot, although most of them were already familiar with the situation since they saw it on the news the night prior. But they'd still go super crazy over it because, well, this is something that came completely unexpected. And as you might expect, we got absolutely nothing done that day at school. In fact, in class, nobody did anything because we were too busy thinking about our teacher. Hell, some people even made memes over this, and those memes were so funny. It was insane. In fact, this controversy is still talked about all the time at early college, as a friend of mine who's a senior confirmed that even the current freshmen know about the situation and joke about it despite it taking place 5 years later. So it's safe to say that my seminar teacher went down as a legend at our school, but for an extremely awful reason. Now, as for how seminar worked, we basically had to have a sub for the next 3 weeks for it, and of course the Algebra 2 students had the same sub for it. While the sub was of course subbing, the school was searching for a temporary math teacher who could also serve as our new seminar teacher. We'd ultimately get one, and I'll talk more about him in February, but I'll go ahead and mention that pretty much no progress would ever be made in seminar after this incident, even when we got our new teacher. Now, of course, this meant that church would also be hectic. As said before, the middle school boys began joining us high school guys for Monday night small groups. This actually proved to be pretty cool since Zach was an 8th grader, and so we would have small groups together, which was nice since he was the only one I still talked to at church. Preston nor his sister had attended church since the fall of 2019, so I was pretty much by myself most of the time. But of course, with Zach being popular, that left me alone quite a bit since he knew so many people. So small groups still sucked, but at least they were better with Zach. Now for that day, Mom and Dad decided we were not going to attend church, as they were very scared about the whole situation. And they were 100% right to be scared. It would be one thing if we had a pedophile at church who I didn't interact with much, but it's a whole nother level when that pedophile was someone both me and my parents trusted. And it's on an even wilder level when you consider that back in middle school boys small groups, I would go to his house every Monday. Yeah, this guy was very dangerous, and I very well could have been a victim. So we decided to skip Wednesday night youth that night and go out to eat as a family in order to calm down and get the whole situation out of our minds. Ultimately, my teacher would still attend my church, although he only attended as a regular member and joined a Sunday school group, so he didn't work with the youth like he did before. Still always felt strange around him and I made sure to keep my distance from him, even as a 19-year-old attending this church during the summer of 2023. So that's the biggest scandal my school ever had. Before I wrap up January, I want to talk about biology. So if you've taken a biology class or literally any science class, you probably did a fair share of experiments, or labs as they're usually referred to as. And if you thought we did labs in this class, well, you'd be damn right, as we did a lot of them. Hell, we even had an individual notebook for labs, where we would of course jot down stuff and keep records. And the best part is I still have that notebook 5 years after taking this class, so I'll get to refer to it throughout the story time to reflect on the labs we did. Now, alongside doing each lab, we also had to write up lab reports. The lab reports had to be written in the format of the scientific method. The scientific method is a multi-step process used for doing scientific research. It's also used in social sciences and other fields too, as it's a reliable way of providing background research for what you are doing, what you think will happen, your results, and your conclusion. If you read any peer-reviewed research paper, you're likely going to notice that the paper is in the format of the scientific method. Now, the scientific method has different steps depending on what you're doing, but for the sake of this story time, I'll only cover the steps we did in our lab reports for this class. So the first step is to write the purpose of the lab. So basically, it's why we're doing the lab. Step 2 is to write the hypothesis. A hypothesis is basically a synonym for a prediction but for science. The third step is to design an experiment. In our case, we just had to describe the experiment we were performing. The fourth step is to then perform the experiment and gather data from it. This is always the best part since that's when we actually get to do stuff. The fifth step is the analysis section, where our teacher would give us some questions about our results and we would have to answer. Then finally, we had to write a conclusion, where we would talk about the results and revisit our hypothesis. Now, the labs we did could be split into two types: mini labs and regular labs. Regular labs involved us performing all the steps to the scientific method, sometimes more. Meanwhile, mini labs were shorter labs, typically taking up only a page or two and usually only involved us doing the hypothesis, the experiment, and data, and conclusion. According to my notebook, it seems like we did 4 of each of them in this class, although that likely would have been more had there not been a particularly extraordinary event that occurred in March that I'll talk about then. I don't exactly remember doing a whole lot of these labs, so I'll have to rely quite a bit on the notebook when discussing them. The first lab we did was a regular lab on Thursday, January 23rd. This lab was about maintaining homeostasis. Homeostasis is basically the human body's ability to maintain stability in response to environmental changes. For example, when the temperature sharply declines, your body will attempt to maintain a normal temperature by giving you the shivers, where your skin clings together. On the other hand, if the temperature sharply rises, you'll likely begin sweating, which is your body's response to dealing with excessive heat by condensing air into water in order to prevent your body from overheating. These are just two examples of homeostatic activity. As for this lab in particular, we basically did an experiment where we attempted to keep a cup at 37 degrees Celsius as much as possible, which is roughly 98.6 degrees Fahrenheit. For it, we would measure the cup's temperature each minute for 12 minutes, and during each measurement, we would be given the option of either placing the cup on a hot plate or keeping it on the counter. Ultimately, trying to keep the water at exactly 37 degrees was way harder than I thought, as in my hypothesis, I figured it wouldn't be all that hard to keep it at that temperature. But no, I'd constantly have to place the cup on and off the hot plate, and I never managed to keep it at exactly 37 degrees, as it would usually hover around that temperature. So in my conclusion, I talked about how it's actually quite difficult to maintain homeostasis and why it's so tough. The next lab we did, that would be our first mini lab, which we did on Monday, January 27th. This is a very small experiment where we took some owl pellets and attempted to find how many animal skeletons were in the pellets. I believe in mine, there were a total of 3 skeletons in the pellets, but since I didn't particularly write much in this lab, I don't really have a lot to say. I do at least remember this lab though, and the pellets that were really disgusting and smell awful. And that's all the labs we did in January. So with all that said, let's move on to February. February 2020 differed immensely from other years, as while this was usually the worst month of the year, February ended up being the best month of 2020. Yeah, it was the best month of the year, surprisingly enough. That's how you know this year was shit when the typically worst month managed to be the best. A lot of that was because this month represented the calm before the storm. As compared to the rest of 2020, this month was super tame and just plain normal. However, it would also be good for a wide multitude of funny stories and moments, as this month had quite a few of them. To start, I'll stay on the topic of biology and talk about the rest of the labs we did this month. Now, compared to January, we did a lot more labs this month since we now knew lab etiquette and how to work in a lab. To start, let's discuss the first lab of the month, being the bird beak adaptation lab, a regular lab we did on Monday, February 3rd. For it, we as a class were basically split into 4 groups, each group representing a different type of beak. Me and my partner, Anonymous, were given tweezers, so our job was to try to gather as much food as possible using tweezers, as tweezers represented a type of beak. Then there were 5 trials, where each trial representing a different environment filled with different types of food. The first trial involved us gathering beans. The second one involved us gathering rubber bands. Then the third represented toothpicks, the fourth represented macaroni, and the fifth represented rocks. Ultimately, me and Anonymous excelled in picking rubber bands and macaronis, but we struggled immensely with rocks. Once we were done with the experiment, we congregated with the other tweezers to groups to gather averages for the tweezers, all of whom got around the same results as us. Then we as a class got together and got class averages, where we could then use the data to do our analysis questions and write our conclusion. The next lab I want to talk about is a regular lab that we were supposed to do, but I only have pre-lab questions in my notebook. But after looking at the date of the pre-lab questions, being Wednesday, February 5th, I immediately knew why, as we ultimately did not do this lab. The reason is because on Thursday, February 6th, the day we were supposed to do the lab, 2 tornadoes ended up touching the ground not far from school. In Storytime 33, I incorrectly stated that it was due to a snowstorm. While we did get a snowstorm that caused school to be canceled this month, that would be later in the month. Just wanted to clarify this error I made for those who watched Storytime 33. Anyways, the tornadoes thankfully never went on full-on. We never went on full-on tornado mode. However, we were prohibited from leaving the building or going outside due to the very strong winds and heavy rain. The storm particularly picked up during study hall at around 10 a.m., as we all watched from the window as the storm got stronger and rain started to pile up. In fact, the rainfall was so much that there was even around half an inch of water piling up outside, so it almost looked like it was flooding. However, many of the school districts in the county were on tornado zone, including Zoe, whose school was very close to the tornado's line of path. Thankfully, it took a different direction, so Zoe's school didn't get hit, but it was super scary over there since they had to gather inside closets and protect their heads. Ultimately, the County Board of Education decided to immediately dismiss school once the tornadoes passed since it had traumatized a lot of students. Therefore, I ended up getting out of school at around lunchtime, which is how I got out of doing that lab. Alright, so then for the next lab I'll talk about is the mini lab we did discussing cells on Wednesday, February 12th. So we were moving on to cells. If you know anything about cells, then you know they're super small. So our teacher had us do this lab to get comfortable with using a microscope. I personally never had any issues using one, although I guess that might not be the case with others since we had previously done an entire lecture on the different parts of a microscope and how to use it. Anyways, this is definitely more of a fun mini lab where we got to use microscopes to look at different stuff. Some of the things we looked at included dead skin cells, yogurt, and cork. After each observation, we had to draw them in our notebooks and label the parts. This is where I accidentally did something really funny. After observing the cork, I drew the cork and labeled what I saw. However, when I attempted to write wall of cork, I accidentally wrote wall of cock. At the time, I didn't notice it, and I don't think my teacher noticed it either, as it was only when reading through my notebook preparing for the story time when I noticed. And oh boy, did I have a field day laughing at this shit. Definitely did not expect to see that, but it's sure funny as hell that I only noticed it 5 years later. Alright, so then the next lab we did was a big lab that also involved us using a microscope. So this is a regular lab we did on Tuesday, February 18th. For it, we got to examine 2 different cells, a stomata cell from a plant and a cheek cell from humans. And by humans, I mean us, as we took some cheek cells by rubbing a toothpick in our mouth. Now for this lab, we had to basically examine the cells and try to identify their organelles from our observation. While I was able to draw most organelles for both cells, I doubt that I really noticed everything since trying to find this stuff under a microscope is tough. More than likely, I just randomly drew different ones, as I'm sure most people did that. Nonetheless, this is a fun lab, and definitely proved that I knew how to use a microscope. Now, there was one more lab that we did this month, and it would be by far the biggest and most memorable lab from the entire class. However, I'm actually going to wait until April to discuss it, since we would do something a lot different with it compared to the other labs. However, if you thought we were done with biology, well, you'd be wrong, as despite us doing plenty of labs, we also worked on a pretty big project for this class at the same time. So back in January, we talked about food chains, which is basically a chart that shows which animals eat which. However, alongside with it, we were also introduced to a project that we completed in mid-February where we had to draw out a food chain on a full sheet of poster board. This poster had to include the sun, a producer, a primary consumer, 2 secondary consumers, a tertiary tertiary consumer, and a decomposer. In case y'all aren't familiar with what these things are, basically producers are organisms that create their own food. These are always consist of plants, as plants conduct the process of photosynthesis to get its food via energy from the sun, which is also why we had to draw the sun. Now, consumers, on the other hand, have to eat other organisms to get energy, whether it be producers or other consumers. Primary consumers eat producers, so these are always your herbivores like deer. Then the secondary consumers are consumers who eat other consumers. Tertiary consumers are those at the top of the food chain, so this includes things like bears, lions, dogs, cats, humans, and more. Finally, decomposers basically decompose dead organisms and rot them away. So things like fungi and worms. So that's kind of a gist of how a food chain works. Now, going back to the project itself, it was a big one. So big in fact that we had to do a total of 4 rough drafts before finally getting to do our finished product. In my first draft, I went with a terrestrial food chain that included a maple tree, a mosquito, a frog, a snake, and an eagle, alongside some bacteria on the eagle. This was absolutely terrible, as it was so bad and the drawings were hideous, which honestly wasn't that surprising given how shit I am at art. For draft 2, I decided to go a completely different direction, where I instead decided to go for an aquatic chain, and as it would turn out, this turned out way better, as I found it easier to draw aquatic animals compared to terrestrial ones. However, this is still a super sloppy draft, as a lot of design choices I made were really stupid. As an example, I placed the sun at the bottom of the chain, which makes no sense because the sun's in the fucking sky, not in the bottom of the goddamn ocean. On top of the sun was algae being eaten by plankton, which was being eaten by a lobster who was then being ate by a jellyfish. All this was a great white shark diving over the water to eat everything. I ended up forgetting a decomposer on it, so it wasn't even complete. Draft 3 would be just as shit, but at least it colored it. However, draft 4 would see a massive improvement. It was from this draft that I finally realized that putting the sun at the bottom of the ocean was an extremely stupid idea. So I instead placed the sun at the top right corner of the page, where it fit in much better and was more obvious than it was the sun. I also did not have any of the animals, not even the shark, eating each other, as I instead placed them on top of each other based on hierarchical sequence, with the shark being on top. And the shark itself was far better drawn too, as it actually looked really cool. Sure, it wasn't like eating everything like before, as it instead was hanging out above the jellyfish, but it still looked cool as hell and looked way better. I also drew a worm on its fin, so I finally had a decomposer. And with the final draft finished, I could move on to the finishing product. After the success I saw with draft 4, I knew exactly what I was going to do, so I was able to get a sheet of poster board and get to work. Ultimately, I spent a total of 4 hours on this, all of which I spent on a single night, being the night of February 12th. During this time, I drew the chain, traced everything, and colored everything, and overall, it looked fantastic. Despite me being an awful artist, the artwork was actually pretty decent, as you could easily tell what each animal and plant was. You can also easily follow the chain too, with the chain going higher the further up the animal was. And overall, it looked amazing and something I think could be considered quality work. And I'd be right, as my teacher was also quite impressed with this project herself, as she gave me a 96 on it. So yeah, that's all we did in biology this month. We did a lot, from all the labs to the project. So now let's move on and talk about English. So this month in English, we did 2 projects related to Cyrano and Roxanne. So let's start with the first Cyrano project. This one was the smaller of the 2. For it, we simply had to create an acrostic poem using Cyrano's full name, being Cyrano de Bergerac. Acrostic poems are basically poems where each line starts with the letter that makes a word vertically. So as an example, an acrostic poem called Poem would have 4 lines, with line 1 starting with P, line 2 starting with O, line 3 starting with E, and line 4 starting with M. But in addition to doing this acrostic, we also had to write the poem related to something from the book. As for what I wrote, I decided to write about Cyrano's nose. By far Cyrano's most defining feature is his SpongeBob looking ass nose, which he's often made fun of throughout the play. In fact, my favorite scene from the entire play actually involves Cyrano's nose, where he was at a party and some people made fun of him for it. But instead of hurling insults or something like that, Cyrano proceeded to go over 30 ways on how to address his nose, where he also roasted his aggressors in the process. This is a super hilarious scene that was made even better in Roxanne when the main character was bullied for the same reason, and he then did the same thing but with more modern stuff. As for my acrostic, I unfortunately do not have any record of it. However, I do remember it being really funny, with me often making fun of Cyrano and roasting him in ways not even he managed to do in the book, including one example where I said that he didn't even need a sword because his nose did the fighting for him. As you could tell, I had a lot of fun with this project, and I'd go as far to say this is hands down the most enjoyable project we did in English. Now, the second project we did was unfortunately nowhere near as fun as the acrostic, but it was still pretty interesting. For it, we basically had to write a compare and contrast paper discussing Cyrano and Roxanne, so we basically had to describe how the two pieces are similar and how they differ. I honestly don't exactly remember what I jotted down, but I do remember us spending a long time on this paper, as for whatever reason, our teacher wanted us to do a bunch of edits on them. She also had us proofread each other's paper, although she had us not include our names and instead had us include only our last 4 digits of our student ID numbers. As you might guess, this was extremely messy, and because of that, she just gave us all 100 on it. Now, moving on from English, let's talk about some fun stuff that happened this month. So first, let's talk about that snowstorm that happened. So on Thursday, February 20th, during lunch, it started snowing. Now, here in the South, it's a huge deal when it snows, as snow is very rare down here. In fact, here in Charlotte, where I live, we just got our first snowfall last month after going over 3 years without seeing snow. So snow is very rare down here, especially compared to places up north in the Midwest. And because it snows so rarely down here, our infrastructure isn't built to handle snow. Therefore, everything shuts down, even if it's only a quarter of an inch, which is why snow is often celebrated down here as opposed to being seen as annoying as some of my Northeastern and Midwestern viewers might view it as. And sure enough, that happened here. The snow kept falling and pretty soon, it began to stick, which excited us all since that meant we were going to be let out early. However, being the wild-ass sophomores we were, we decided to go outside and play in it. It hadn't built up for us to make snowballs or anything, but it did start to build up. Therefore, Edward, who became popular back in freshman year for T-posing in the rain for 30 minutes, decided to pull a similar stunt. He, in just a t-shirt and jeans, was going to go out in the snow and make snow angels. So he actually went out there and made snow angels, although he only lasted 10 seconds because it was that cold and the snow had frozen his back, but it was still funny watching him go. Ultimately, we were dismissed from school after lunch, allowing us to go home and get out of school the following day too, giving us a nice long weekend. I next want to talk about a really funny incident involving Peter. So if you guys remember back from September, you might recall Peter as being one of the guys involved in the War of 214, where he threw markers and other stuff at Edward. Anyways, one day at school, the internet was very slow. Not sure why, but it just was. It was at the very beginning of study hall, so the teacher for it hadn't even arrived. However, Peter was already there and on his Chromebook, struggling to get past Chrome. But this outage ended up pissing him off. And by pissed off, I mean he got really pissed off. So much so that after trying for over and over to load something, Peter got so mad that he punched his Chromebook, causing its screen to develop a huge black hole and be filled with cracks. Immediately, me and everyone started dying laughing while Peter calmed down and started laughing with us. His Chromebook was completely unusable, as the parts of the screen that was on just plain white. Me and everyone else got pictures of his computer because you just don't normally see someone destroying their Chromebooks, especially at my school. After laughing and goofing off over this, Peter turned his computer into the technology guy, where he was able to receive a replacement and the technology guy was able to send it in to get fixed. Peter ultimately had to pay for the damages, but nonetheless, it was super funny seeing what he did to it. Alright, so now let's talk about college. So in American government, we did our class project this month. For it, we would create a PowerPoint presentation on one of 3 things. A presentation on a former president, meaning any president excluding Donald Trump since this was during his first term in office, a presentation comparing Democrats to Republicans, or a presentation on a political organization. We did not have to present these, we just had to submit them. I, alongside most of the class, decided to just do one on comparing the Democrats to Republicans. So for it, I had to basically showcase what each party's opinion was on certain political issues. Overall, this was actually a really good presentation. For some issues, I just wrote paragraphs explaining the issues, whereas others, I would use images or GIFs. I also want to add that I think I did a great job staying unbiased. In Storytime 43, I complained about showing favoritism towards one of the parties. However, looking through this presentation, I could not find a single bit of bias in this entire presentation, as I portrayed both political parties fairly and accurately. Sure, I did add some humor using memes and GIFs, but I made fun of both parties equally and stayed completely unbiased in the entire presentation, so I'm not entirely sure what bias I was finding when writing Storytime 43, as it seemed very unbiased when I was looking through this thing. but as you might expect, I made 100 on it, with my professor commenting that she really enjoyed the memes and gifs in the presentation, so this is a pretty successful presentation. Nothing else really sticks out from pre-calc or corrections, so let's go back to high school and talk about seminar. So around the middle of the month, specifically on Monday, February 17th, our school finally hired a temporary math teacher who could teach seminar. This teacher was actually retired, as he had spent his whole life teaching high school math, but he figured that he would do some teaching for a little while to make some extra money. He was a super cool guy and always very chill. My friends who had him for Algebra 2 really liked him too, as he was a good teacher. But the best part is that our teacher would also enjoy us. In fact, he enjoyed our school and how we did things so much that after the year ended, he decided to quit retirement and become our school's new permanent 10th grade math teacher because he just loved his job so much. So shout out to my school on this fantastic hiring decision. Now, even though we had a full-on seminar teacher now, the majority of the class did not make any progress on the children's book. Me and my partner would be the exceptions, as it would be this month when I officially wrote the book itself and printed the pages, allowing my partner to begin drawing and coloring, meaning I was done with my part. She would make good progress on the book until mid-March when the big event that happened that month occurred, which I'll get to then. And with that wraps up February. Let's move on to March of 2020. What an absolutely crazy and, funnily enough, very historic month, as this month will go down in the history books in a few years because of an incredibly big event that I'll get to later. This month would also mark the start of a new era for me. Not only would Post-Depression Period Part 2 end this month, but this month would also start the second phase of my time at early college, as the rest of my time at early college from this month forward would be completely different from what I experienced up to this point. Now, typically, I like to describe what I did in each class by going class by class. However, because of the big event, I'm actually going to go over everything before the big event, and then of course discuss the big event and everything that happened during it. So to start, I'll discuss the end of American government. Honestly, there's not much to say about it since we didn't have a final or anything. We just had our last day of class and that was that. And with American government finished, we started our last 8-week course on Monday, March 9th. This new class is Business 137, which is Principles of Management. This class covers the fundamentals of management, what a manager does, and good decision making. Our school had us take this class as it corresponded with our grades intensive question, being, how do I make good choices? They also had us take it since many of us were old enough to work and many of us even had part-time jobs. I didn't, although I'd work one during senior year that I'll touch on in part 8. Just like the other half-semester courses, this course took place Monday through Thursday from 2:30 to 3:45 in the college side of our school's building. As for the professor, I do not remember her all that well, and for good reason, as we would only attend this class in person for a grand total of 4 days. However, from my experience in class these 4 days, class was super boring and I struggled to stay awake most of the time, so I could say that she was pretty boring. Now moving on to high school, let's talk about biology. So on Tuesday, March 10th, we did what unexpectedly became our final lab for the class. It was a mini lab on the stages of mitosis. It was very similar to the mini lab and regular labs we did regarding cells, whereas in those labs we used a microscope to examine cells. In this lab we used microscopes to examine mitosis. We used a microscope to examine different cells at different stages of mitosis, and then we drew the cells in our notebook. It was definitely among the more forgettable labs we did, as I didn't write much about it in my notebook and I don't particularly remember much from doing the lab. So it's a pretty tame way to wrap up labs for the class. Also in biology, we were introduced to what would be the biggest project we did this semester. In fact, this project was not just a group project, it was a class project. For it, we as a class had to create a life-size fungi cell, and we had to create and list its individual parts using real-life objects. We were going to spend the rest of the semester working on it, where we would get together each Monday during seminar to work on it as a class. However, this project was introduced to us on Thursday, March 12th, the last day of school before the big event of the month occurred. Because of that, this project would be canceled before we even started on it. Moving on to English, let's talk about our next thing. So at this point, I think our teacher gave up on having us read books and giving us quizzes and stuff. So instead, on Monday, March 2nd, we took a field trip to the main part of the community college to the library. Here we had to check out a book, read it over the course of the month, and then do a book report on it. I completely forgot what the name of the book I checked out was, but I only know I read like a third of it and used Spark Notes for the rest of it, where I then wrote the book report and easily made 100 on it by bullshitting it. Then for crew, we began our second choose your own project. This is a birdhouse, so for it, we would split into groups and have to build a birdhouse. Simple enough. Me and the other sophomores worked together on ours. Now, the challenge was getting the materials. Thankfully, during this time, I was actually in the process of tearing down the old treehouse my dad built back in 2007 for me and Zoe. And of course, as I was tearing it down, I was taking apart the wood. Therefore, I decided to keep some of the wood for the birdhouse. However, the day I was working on it, being Saturday, March 7th, Dad saw me working on it and became interested. I told him what I was doing, and he decided to help me out with it. Initially, I was just trying to get the wood, but Dad went as far as to help me build the entire thing, and after 2 hours of work, we had a full-on functional birdhouse. All was left was the painting. Now, this is a great timing, as for the past 2 weeks, me and my group did not have anything to work on since I didn't have any wood yet. As a result, our crew leader was growing more and more frustrated with us. So after showing my group the completed birdhouse that Monday and crew, I told them that I was going to pull a prank on our teacher. So how this prank worked is that I hid the birdhouse underneath the desk. When she walked in, she was going to ask where our parts were. I was going to tell her that we didn't have them, but then after she would ask when the parts arrived, I would say, wait, I think I found something underneath the desk, and then pull out the birdhouse. My group was all for it, so we decided to do that. Sure enough, our teacher came in and asked where our parts were. I told her we didn't have them as planned, but this time, instead of complaining about us not having our parts, she got extremely furious. Like, I'm talking at least 10 times more angry than the angriest she got at me during 9th grade, as she got super pissed off. As loud as she could, she said, "Okay, that's enough. I'm sick and tired of waiting for y'all to get the parts when y'all are clearly not going to get them." She then started ordering each of us to go to different parts of the classroom, and as she was doing that, I whipped out the birdhouse. That's when one of the members of our group started laughing, which enraged our teacher immensely. She asked her what was so funny, and then the member pointed towards me. Immediately, our teacher lost every single bit of anger as she breathed a massive sigh of relief while me and the whole class started laughing. She herself started laughing and then after calming down, she high-fived each of us and started going off on how well made the birdhouse was and how great it looked. Once she was finished, me and the rest of the group high-fived each other over our successful birdhouse and prank. This prank ended up working way better than we anticipated, as our teacher got way angrier than we expected. It also helped that I was the one who pulled it off, as I was probably the only student at the whole school who could have pulled a prank on our teacher and gotten away with it. So it worked out super well. For the rest of crew and that day and on Wednesday, my group members worked on painting and the birdhouse and decorating it. I didn't do much painting since I already did my part in building it, but I still overlooked the painting and made sure everything looked good. And sure enough, we ended up getting it painted on Wednesday, March 11th, and it looked great and is to this day still hung up in the garden area outside, where it has been the home of a red cardinal for almost 5 years now. So now the last thing I have to discuss before the big event is a fire alarm my school had. Now in school, you probably had to practice fire drills, where you would walk as a class in a single filed line outside and away from the building. Well, while we did plenty of these fire drills throughout my time in school, in this case, the fire alarm went off and it was not a drill. It happened during biology at around 1:30. The fire alarm went off, so we made our way outside, assuming it was a drill. However, after 15 minutes, we were still not let back into school like we usually would have by then. We all began sitting there wondering what was going on. Soon afterwards, our biology teacher let us know what happened. Apparently, on the floor above our school, someone burnt some chicken in a culinary class, causing the chicken to catch on fire and for the smoke to reach the fire alarm. As a result, we had to stay outside for an entire hour and a half while the fire department came in and took care of the smoke. As a result, we ended up getting out of half of management, which was nice since that class is of course boring, but it was still pretty crazy for the fire alarm to go off and not be a drill, even if that would be super common in college since people not only couldn't cook for shit, but they'd sometimes pull the alarm for shits and giggles too, which was always so fucking annoying. Now, that previous Sunday was also quite special, as it was of course March 8th. This particular day marked 2 years since my suicide attempt. While I didn't particularly do anything to celebrate like I did the year before, I spent the whole day reflecting on the situation back from 8th grade and thinking about how much I had grown since then and how I was in such a better position. While I was still taking Zoloft and doing therapy, I was in such a better position. I was doing much better mentally and was just in a better spot overall. So it was great seeing how things got better since then and how well I've been doing since then. And with that all said, that brings us to the big event that caused this month. Even though I've kind of built it up throughout the story time, you already know what it was since it was a worldwide thing. That big event was of course the COVID-19 pandemic. So near the end of 2019, some guy in Wuhan, China decided to eat a bat, and all of a sudden, he's got this condition called coronavirus, causing him to single-handedly shut down the global economy, international trade, and basically the entire world for a year. Well, obviously that's just a rumor, but that's what a lot of people thought happened. Anyways, on Sunday, March 15th, it was announced that we would not be attending school for the next 2 weeks in order to stop the spread of the rapidly contagious coronavirus. Instead, we would be partaking in online school, where we would be doing our coursework online. Both of my parents were also ordered to work remotely too, so that's what happened. Now, honestly, as much as I love my parents, I hated doing online school when they were at home. Well, at least when mom was home. As we're going to see in part 7, it was easily bearable and actually really fun when it was just dad at home, since he's always been the more relaxed parent between him and mom. However, for the rest of this school year, both of them were at home, so I had to endure both mom and dad. Anyways, the reason it was so unbearable was because for the first 2 weeks, they decided to have me and Zoe follow a schedule in order to keep us in the mind of things before going back to school when the 2 weeks were up. While this schedule wasn't particularly terrible, as it allowed us to get up at 8 and be done with the day at 2 and was overall actually pretty easy, it was just the idea of us having to follow a schedule while at home that made me and Zoe feel far more trapped than we already felt. Sure, we followed a schedule at school, but the fact that we were at home and had the opportunity to do things our own way, but weren't allowed to by our parents, did not feel liberating at all. Our parents instituted this schedule in order for us to stay on top of our schoolwork and maintain good mental health. However, it ended up having a completely opposite effect on our mental health, as it made me and Zoe feel far more caged than we already were, and as a result, it ended up causing post-depression period part 2 to end for me just a week shy of a year, since it began back on March 23rd, 2019. It also didn't help that the schedule was unnecessary. Me and Zoe were both honor roll students who had no trouble getting good grades and getting our work done, with the exception of biology in my case, but that's only because my teacher was an asshole with the due times. So it just didn't feel necessary to have, since we got our work done and were well behaved. Now for the schedule itself, it started with us waking up at 8 a.m. and eating breakfast. Then at 9, I would go to the living room to lift weights. I'd usually bullshit these since I never knew what I was doing. At 10, it would be schoolwork time, so this would be time for me to get my schoolwork done. I usually didn't spend much time doing schoolwork though, since during this time and for the rest of the school year, our teachers would be very lenient with us and not assign a whole lot of work since these were tough times. Then at 12, I'd have lunch. At 1, me and Zoe would head over to our grandmother's house to hang out with her for an hour. And then after that, we were done. So by no means this is a bad schedule, as it was actually a pretty good one. It just made me feel like we were more trapped since we had to follow a schedule on top of not being able to leave home and stuff. Thankfully, after only 2 weeks, when it was eventually announced that we'd be doing online school for the rest of the school year, Mom and Dad completely stopped enforcing the schedule and basically told us that we could do whatever as long as we were getting our shit done. We still had to do our schoolwork from 10 to 12, but at least we could now wake up at 9 and start our day later. We also still had to visit our grandmother at 1, which wasn't a big deal at all since she'd sometimes bake us cookies and I enjoyed talking with her. So luckily, Mom and Dad realized that the schedule wasn't necessary at all, and that me and Zoe were better off doing our own thing than being told what to do and when to do it. As a result, lockdown got a lot more bearable after the 2 weeks, although it still took a toll on my mental health since I was of course stuck at home. Now, while things weren't going too good at home, they'd go on to be monumentally better at church. Because of the pandemic, our church started live streaming online services, so me and my family would gather in the living room each Sunday to watch the service. Then Sunday school, Wednesday night, and Monday night small groups would meet over Zoom, although I didn't attend any of these meetings. But because of the COVID and not being able to go to church, I was unexpectedly provided with plenty of time to disassociate with the guys from my grade, since I wasn't seeing them at all compared to the 3 times a week back before COVID. So this was super nice, as well as one of the better things to come out of COVID, even if the shit would start back up again when we returned to in-person church at the beginning of 2021. By the way, even though it was bad since I didn't like doing online school and it would pretty much take over half my entire high school experience, the COVID-19 pandemic also had its fair share of good stuff. Of course, getting out of church would be one of the best parts about the pandemic, but the pandemic would also be great for me because, as we're going to see in part 7, contrary to most students, I greatly excelled with the online schooling and ended up making some of the highest grades I ever made in junior year. However, that wouldn't exactly be the case for sophomore year, since my grades dipped a little in a few classes, but it proved to be very good for me later on. It also provided me plenty of time to relax and gave me an unexpectedly large amount of free time, most of which I spent streaming Pokemon Showdown, watching YouTube videos, and writing. So even though it was bad, there were some great things that happened because of the pandemic. Now let's talk about academics during the pandemic period of March of 2020. I'll start with biology. So when the pandemic hit, since we were doing online school, our teacher decided to stop being annoying with the due times and instead made every single one of our assignments due at 11:59. Despite this seeming so small, it proved to be absolutely monumental for me, as it would be this exact change that caused my grade to skyrocket in this class. In quarter 3, I made an 83 in the class because of how stupid the due times were and how they were not consistent at all. However, now that everything was due at 11:59, I had a much easier time keeping track of assignments, and as a result, I did not miss a single assignment during the fourth quarter, allowing me to make a 96 in this class for quarter 4. Yeah, all it took was our teacher not being a bitch about making completely inconsistent due times for me to thrive in this class. So shout out to my biology teacher for changing her system and actually allowing me and the others to treat this class normally. I'm sure had this system been in place all along, I would have made an A during the third quarter. She also accepted late work during this time, and even though I wasn't late on a single assignment, it was still nice knowing that due times were just suggestions, not deadlines, especially with how hectic things were adjusting to this new lifestyle. Also, with regards to that class-wide fungi cell project, it got cancelled, unsurprisingly enough. Since we of course could not meet together as a class, it was scrapped and we didn't do it. We would eventually do a class-wide project for future classes, which I'll get to talk about at the very end of part 7. So moving on from biology, let's talk about English. So honestly, there's not a whole lot to talk about with regards to this class. We would begin reading short stories and answer questions and all that, but we didn't really do much for the rest of the semester. We even stopped doing stems, which sucks since those were always a nice grade booster. As a result, my grade in this class slipped and became a B, although I'll talk more about how grades work for this last quarter at the end of the story time. Now, when it comes to seminar, it was completely waived for us. As a result, we did not have to complete the children's book, and we also did not have to do SLCs that April. Therefore, seminar was completed and we all automatically passed it. The same thing would apply to crew. Now, moving on to college. So pre-cal was a lot harder online than in person, which makes sense since math classes are always tough to do online. Therefore, this class got a lot harder thanks to COVID. The same can also be said about corrections. However, this month made this class all the more bullshit, as now that we didn't attend class, there was no way that we could have gotten any of the statistics for quizzes since of course they were based on our professor's book. As a result, the rest of the semester for this class would be completely full of shit, but things would get way worse in May as we'll get to then. Then management is a weird one since I only attended class for 1 week. Therefore, my memory from this class made it almost feel like this class was an online class to begin with. We'd have a chapter quiz due each week as well as a couple of papers this semester. The first one we did which we did this month, which was the personality paper. So for it, we had to take the Myers-Briggs personality test, MBTI, and discuss our results in a paper and how accurate we thought it was. Now, the MBTI is kind of weird, as if you take the test once a year or so, you're down to get a different result. For example, when I took this test for this paper, I was classified as an INTP, which is introverted, intuitive, thinking, and perceiving. When I retook it for Storytime 33, I got ISTJ, which is introverted, sensing, thinking, and judging. I did it again in college and got ISFJ, which is introverted, sensing, feeling, and judging. And then for this Storytime, I decided to retake it and I ended up getting INFP, which is introverted, intuitive, feeling, and perceiving. So it changes pretty often, and that seems to be the case with most people. Anyways, for it, I basically had to explain the different parts of my personality and how accurate I thought the quiz was, as well as to determine the strengths and weaknesses of my personality. The first symbol is of course the one that's never changed, being introversion. Even though I'm much better at being social and interacting with others than I was 5 years ago, I've always been a huge introvert. As a kid, while others would go outside and play with their neighbors, I would stay inside and play video games, play with my blocks, or build a Hot Wheel track. And that's still the case today as an adult. As while most people my age like to go out, party, and attend social events, I choose to instead write, watch anime, do math problems, and pretty much anything else by myself in my apartment. Albeit, I'm definitely more extroverted now than I was as a kid, but I'm still very much a big introvert. So this one was very easy to explain and talk about. The second symbol is intuition. So the intuitives tend to think about the future and the theoretical, whereas sensitives tend to focus more on the past and present and only look at what they have now. I was a sensitive in college, which is part of the reason I majored in accounting since it focuses on the past and current financial data. And I also think that becoming intuitive again is part of the reason why I regret majoring in accounting, as I would have done much better in a field of study that focuses on the future and attempts to predict the future, such as finance or economics. Luckily, I actually don't work in accounting, as I work in finance, and it's definitely a great job since I get to use my intuition to forecast financial trends and data analysis, which is really fun and way better than accounting. One of these days, I'm definitely going to write an entire storytime on regretting my major and how I pivoted to a new role, since it's a very interesting story that I think a lot of college graduates can relate to. The third symbol is thinking, which of course changed to feeling. So thinkers tend to be more direct and usually focus on facts rather than take into account other people and their feelings. I was definitely more like this as a kid and teen, as I would often say what I wanted to say without any regard to how others would feel about it. I've since changed quite a bit in this regard, as now I'm often too afraid to say something even remotely out of line in fear of hurting someone else. I also tend to take into account other people's feelings when making a decision, which is why I'm more of a feeler than a thinker. Then the final symbol is perceiving. So perceivers are people who like variety. They're often people who don't enjoy repetitive tasks and usually aren't a fan of order. They also don't like following schedules or really anything structural. I for sure see myself as this, as I'm not a fan of repetitive tasks. In fact, this is also another reason why I don't like accounting, especially tax accounting like what I was doing at my old public accounting job, as it's basically the same stuff every day. Meanwhile, at my current job, I pretty much do something different every day, which I love since it keeps my job entertaining and I'm not bored with a certain task. My perceivingness can also be seen with my desk at work, as it's a huge mess with papers all over it. I personally don't mind that it's messy, since I can easily find everything since I remember where it's all at. It's especially messy when you compare my desk to my coworker's desk, as she keeps her area much cleaner and organized than I do. Overall, it was a pretty easy and fun paper to write, even if I don't particularly see how this is related to management or organizational behavior. Nonetheless, it was easy, so I can't complain. So that's how college classes were doing. Going back to global news, it turns out that COVID-19 wasn't just some virus that could be taken under control by quarantining for 2 weeks. Instead, it was a full-on global pandemic that required us to quarantine for much longer. As a result, it was announced that we would return to in-person instruction on May 1st. But as we of course all know, that wouldn't happen since, well, this is the fucking COVID-19 pandemic we're talking about. And as a result, it shouldn't come to no surprise that by the end of April, it would be announced that we would be learning remotely for the rest of the school year, which is also why Mom and Dad did away with the schedule, since they realized that this was a much more long-term global event, not a short stint. And that's all I have for March of 2020. Holy hell, this month was crazy. And it would be this month when everything changed. Even 5 years later, things are still different today than from before COVID. For example, health is taken a lot more seriously now, as it's far easier to call in sick and be excused compared to before the pandemic. Remote work and online school are also more prevalent now. Sure, K-12 schools are now 100% in person, but many colleges offer more online classes. And of course, Walmart is no longer open 24 hours now, so you can no longer buy 12-pack cases of Dr. Pepper at 3 a.m. So even though the pandemic ended 3 years ago, it's still wild to think that things never truly went back to the way before the pandemic. So now let's move on to April. As you might expect, this is a very uneventful month because, well, I nor anyone really did or could do much. This month was entirely focused on quarantining and stopping the spread of coronavirus, but there was a few notable things that happened this month that I'd like to share. To start, let's talk about biology. More specifically, I'm actually going to go back to February. So when discussing February, I mentioned that we did a major lab that would become relevant in April. So I figured that we'll take a little leap to the past to discuss the lab. So this lab was called egg osmosis, and we performed it on Monday, February 24th. This lab covered the concepts of osmosis and diffusion. Before I discuss the lab itself, I first want to talk about what these things are and some other concepts, since I'll be throwing them around quite a bit when discussing this lab. Do be aware that I might get some of this information wrong, as it's of course been 5 years since I've seen this stuff. If I say anything incorrect about osmosis or anything similar, feel free to correct me in the comments. So cells go through a process called osmosis, which is when water moves from a more concentrated solution in the cell to a less concentrated solution. On the other hand, there's also diffusion, which is when cell molecules move from a low concentration to a high concentration. These are not to be mistaken as an opposite of osmosis, since it deals with molecules and not water. Now, there are 3 different levels of use to describe an osmotic state. So the normal osmotic level is called isotonic state, which is when the cell is exhibiting homeostasis. Now, when osmosis occurs, a cell will enter into a hypertonic state, which of course means the cell has a higher osmotic level than normal, causing the cell to weigh more. On the other hand, a cell in a hypotonic state means that the cell is going through diffusion, and that causes cells to weigh less. So that should be all the scientific background. Let's talk about the experiment itself. So for it, we basically simulated osmosis and diffusion using an egg. The egg of course represented the cell, and the yolk represented the nucleus of the cell. Prior to the lab, our teacher had let the egg sit in vinegar for 24 hours to weaken their shell, which made it easy to peel the shell off but keep the membrane on, as the membrane would be a key feature that we would be spending a lot of time focusing on. Now, the first part of the lab was by far the toughest. So for it, we needed to crack open the shell, but keep the membrane on. So under the shell of the egg is a weak liquid barrier that surrounds the egg that prevents bacteria from growing in the egg. Normally when you crack open an egg, you break this membrane since it's super weak compared to human strength. However, since the eggs were placed in vinegar, it was possible for us to open the shell without breaking the membrane, and that's what we did here. Me and my partners focused intently on getting the egg out, and sure enough, we were successful. In fact, the whole class was able to get their eggs out with no issues, which impressed our teacher since she expected at least one of us to fail at this part. Anyways, once we got the egg out, we jotted down the data. We first took quantitative data by measuring the egg's weight, and then we jotted down qualitative data such as how the egg felt and looked. Once we were done with that, we placed the egg in a cup of water, where we then waited 30 minutes to let it do its thing. During these 30 minutes, our teacher talked more about the lab itself and why this lab was going to be the biggest lab we did this semester. So pretty much she selected this lab to be a lab where we wrote a professional lab report. For our previous labs, we simply hand wrote them in our notebooks and our teacher would then grade them. And while we would initially handwrite the lab report for this lab like the others, we were then going to type them up. Additionally, the report itself also had to be more professional than our previous ones, as we were pretending like we were actual biologists with this lab. As a result, this lab would be worth a good chunk of our grade since it was of course such a big project. I'll talk more about the report after I finish discussing the experiment. Once the 30 minutes were up, we then got to check the eggs, and as it turned out, the eggs were different, as now we could see the yolk. In the egg in its normal form, we couldn't see the yolk, but because osmosis did its thing, we could see the yolk since water had moved to a less concentrated area. So we then weighed the egg and it ended up weighing a gram more than it did before placing it in water, proving that cells in hypertonic states gain weight. The egg itself also felt like rubber, as it was really squishy. Bubbles had also developed on the egg too. Then the next part of the lab was to place our eggs in syrup, but instead of leaving them there for 30 minutes, we were going to wait 24 hours. I don't know why we didn't do 24 hours in water, as I'm sure that might have skewed our results some. But nonetheless, we placed the egg in syrup for 24 hours, where we returned the next day to see what had happened, and sure enough, the egg had certainly changed quite a bit. And by changed a bit, I mean the egg looked and smelled like utter shit. It appeared super old and rotten, smelled absolutely awful, and just looked extremely inedible. I even got to touch and hold it, and it looked like the liquid in the egg was trying to fall out, but it couldn't since the membrane was keeping it in the egg. The egg also felt like paper and was overall more fragile than normal eggs. We didn't measure the egg and it had a significant decrease in weight, meaning diffusion had occurred. And that wrapped up the lab itself. As for the lab report, it was a lot larger than the regular labs we did. The first thing we did was pre-lab questions, where we simply wrote down questions and answers as part of our homework the week before the lab. We then wrote some keywords and their definitions. Afterwards, we went into our regular lab steps, where we had our purpose, hypothesis, lab design, and the data. Then came the analysis questions. These were really funny because we actually did these in class the day after the diffusion section of the lab, and our teacher literally gave us the answers to these. So this was by far the easiest part of the lab since I just had to write down the questions and answers to them. Then we had the conclusion, and that wrapped up the lab. Now, the reason I'm just now talking about this lab is because the actual typed up lab report would not be due until Monday, April 13th. The reason we had a whole 2 months to write this report was not only because it was a longer lab report than normal, but we also had to cite sources, use references, and add a bibliography, just like in real studies. We also had to draw graphs and use charts for our data too. Therefore, our teacher wanted to take the time to show us how APA format works and how to cite sources. Since I already had plenty of experience citing sources from many of my classes back in 9th grade, and even from the previous semester in English, Technology and Society, and Sociology, I had no issue getting accustomed to the APA format and writing this report. As a result, I managed to write the entire thing in one night in only around 3 hours, allowing me to submit it on Friday, April 10th. However, I only made an 85 on this report. No fucking clue why I didn't make at least an A. In fact, I even read it through since I still had the report, and I couldn't find any issue with it, as it was formatted properly, there weren't any grammatical errors, and the sources were cited properly. So I don't know what happened here, but at least this thing was done, making it the biggest assignment I did during the COVID-19 portion of sophomore year. Moving on from biology, let's talk about college. So in management, we wrote another paper. This time we had to interview someone who was a manager. The rules were that we had to interview with a manager who wasn't a family member or a current boss, which was a huge bummer since I could have easily interviewed my mom since she used to own a competitive cheerleading business prior to becoming a teacher. But in addition, these interviews had to be done in person. Yeah, in person, during the fucking COVID-19 pandemic. Thankfully, after reaching out to my professor, she told me that I could do the interview virtually, which definitely helped because no way was I going to be able to do the interviews with someone in person at this time. But it was still stupid that she never even updated the rules since, well, nobody could do an in-person interview. Not even after I emailed her did she update them, which certainly confused a lot of the class. However, I still had no idea who to talk to because, well, I didn't know anyone who could be considered a manager. Luckily, Dylan took this class the semester prior, so I was able to reach out to him, where he was then able to get me in contact with the guy he interviewed. So the guy he interviewed was a shift supervisor from the North Carolina Highway Patrol. I was able to set up a time with him to interview him, and it went pretty well. Got to learn a lot about what he does and the stuff he does as a manager, even if he managed a government sector and not a corporation or private business. But it still all went well, allowing me to write the paper and make 100 on it. So moving on from management, let's talk about corrections. So during this month, we did our research paper, where we had to research an issue with the correctional system and discuss solutions. My research was on violence in prisons. As it is very widely known, prisons are very dangerous places, as it's for sure a good reason to avoid committing crimes. So my research was on violence, why it's a big issue, and what needs to be done about it. It was overall a very forgettable paper that I don't have any documentation for, but I do remember making 100 on it. We were also supposed to make a PowerPoint presentation and present these, but because of COVID, that obviously never happened. And honestly, that's all that really happened this month. April 2020 was for sure the least eventful month of sophomore year since we couldn't exactly do a whole lot. So now let's move on to May. May 2020 would be a much more eventful month than April. Of course, being the last month of the school year played a big role in that, but there was also even more on top of the unusual end-of-year activities that made May a big month. By far the biggest thing to happen this month was finally getting a new pet. So in part 5, I talked about our dog dying. He was a German Shepherd and was a lovable dog, but he was bleeding from the inside, so we decided to put him down. And for the next year and a half, we went without any pets. However, just a couple of days after the pandemic began, a cat started showing up on our property. The cat was quite hostile towards humans, which me and my family theorized was because she was likely abused by humans in the past. But nonetheless, she would still roam our yard. Eventually, Mom started to feed her, which the cat really liked. So much so that sometime in mid-April, she started to bring her 2 kittens with her. The kittens looked quite similar to her, although one was male and the other was female. We decided to name the mother of the cat Smokette since her fur looked like smoke. We decided to name the female cat Twinkle because her fur had spots that looked like scars, while we named the male kitten Floppy because when he walked, he often flopped around. However, tragedy would strike in late April when we found Twinkle dead. She appeared to have died from an attack by another cat. So when she died, Smokette and Floppy disappeared for a week, which had us all concerned that something happened to the 2 of them too. Luckily, on the night of Friday, May 1st, while Mom and Dad were hanging out on the front porch, Smokette appeared. She meowed in a very concerned manner, almost as if she was trying to get Mom and Dad's attention. So Mom and Dad got up and sure enough, Smokette wanted them to follow her. So they did that and sure enough, she led them to a small nest where she had Floppy chilling. Mom and Dad knew Floppy was in immediate danger being out in the wilderness alone, so they got a towel and picked Floppy up, which Smokette did not protest. They then took Floppy to my grandmother's, as she used to own a cat, so she was familiar with how to take care of the cat. She placed him in a big black bucket, where she was also able to give him some food and water. Then the next morning, we went to our grandmother's house to see Floppy. Here we got to take Floppy out of his bucket and even hold and pet him. He was very clearly scared, but he certainly enjoyed being petted and exploring my grandmother's home. Eventually, we brought him back to our house, where we decided to let him hang out on the screen and porch in our backyard. We bought a kitty bed for him and also a litter box, so he now had a safe place to stay. Initially, we were just going to keep him temporarily before taking him to an animal shelter. However, I would unexpectedly fall in love with Floppy. I mean, who wouldn't? He was a super small and absolutely adorable little kitten. Who wouldn't? but I took a keen interest in him, often going out to play with him, pet him, and I would also be in charge of watering him. As a result, we both formed a very special bond, and soon, Floppy would fully trust me and identify me as his owner. Therefore, we decided to keep Floppy permanently, which would go on to be a great decision since we all would love playing with him, and he would prove to be one of, if not the best thing to come out of the COVID-19 pandemic. As for Smokette, I'll talk more about her in part 7. Alright, so moving on from furry friends, let's talk about how I wrapped up my classes from this absolutely hectic school year. So firstly, due to the pandemic, all standardized final exams, NCFEs, end-of-course exams, EOCs, and end-of-grade exams, EOGs, were cancelled. This was great for me, as both 10th grade English and biology were EOC classes, meaning they had a more serious and longer final than normal classes. Therefore, I got out of taking these 2 EOCs, and it would be because of the pandemic that the state decided to simply do away with NCFEs, meaning any high school class that would not have an EOC class, would not be an EOC class, would no longer have a final exam. Meanwhile, EOCs would start back up at the end of 2021, but since I had no more EOC classes after sophomore year, that meant that I would not have to take any more finals for high school for the rest of my time in high school. This also made 9th grade the only school year where I took finals for high school, and 8th grade as the only school year I took a legitimate EOC. As for my final grades in each class, for English, due to just not doing well with this class virtually, I only made an 88 in quarter 4. However, we could actually get our quarter 4 grades waived if they would harm our overall grade due to the pandemic. Therefore, I got this quarter's grade waived and ended up making a 94 in this class, solidifying an A in it. For biology, I would not need this waiver, as my grade shot up this quarter. Because our teacher made everything due at 11:59 and was more lenient with late work, I ended up making a 96 during the COVID portion of the class, so I did not need a waiver for it, although I did ultimately only make an 89 in this class, giving me a very high B and being so close to an A. So those were my high school classes. Let's talk about wrapping up college courses. So let's start with management, since it was the least eventful finish. To wrap up our class, we took a comprehensive exam. I did not do that well on it, only making a 65 on it. This dropped my grade down to an 87, giving me a B as my final grade in the class. To be fair though, that's not bad, especially since the high was a 78, so I didn't do too bad on it. Now, moving on to corrections. It was here when our professor did by far the most asshole thing a professor can do, giving a surprise final. Yup, she sent an announcement that in 4 days, we would be taking a comprehensive final exam. Nowhere in the class syllabus was a final outline, and there was nowhere else on any announcement that said we had a final. As you might expect, I was pissed off because our professor just all of a sudden was giving us a final despite it not being outlined in the syllabus. And as you might expect, the finals questions all came from her book, meaning there was absolutely no way for any of us to pass this final. I ultimately made a 47 on it, which ended up being the highest grade in the class. Thankfully, it was only worth 10% of our grade, allowing me to keep an A in the class and get a grade of 91. But this pissed me off so much because our professor was such a fucking asshole who didn't know how to communicate shit. So I grilled the fuck out of her in the course evaluation, talking about how unorganized and terribly she ran this class. I get it was her first semester teaching, but even a first year professor knows not to give a surprise final, especially when it's not even outlined in the fucking syllabus. So fuck my corrections professor for being hands down the worst professor I had at early college. Now the final college class I have discussed is pre-calc. So the final for this class was split into 2 parts. The first part was a multiple choice exam with around 30 questions. We didn't have to show work with these, we just had to answer questions correctly, so I did that and made a 90 in the section. But the next part of the exam was much more memorable. So this was a written portion, where we were given around 10 problems, but we had to show all of our work on them like our normal exams for the class, and holy fuck did I work my ass off on this test. I worked on it for a total of 6.5 hours, making sure I was doing everything right and had all my work correct. That was for 6 hours. The last 30 minutes was spent writing the academic honesty statement on every single page. As for God knows why, we had to write this thing on every page, which was annoying as fuck and really hurt my hand. Nonetheless, I made a 97 on the section, so I still did well on it and wrapped up the class with an 85, giving me a B in this class. And with academics finished up, the school year had come to an end. Normally, my school would do an awards day for the last day of school. However, because of the pandemic, that didn't happen. So instead, we were finishing up with all of our assignments, we were done with school and didn't have to log in anymore, making this by far the most anticlimactic end of a school year. Our last day of school was technically Wednesday, May 20th, but in my case, my last assignment was due on Friday, May 15th, so that's when the school year ended for me. And that officially wraps up sophomore year. While the majority of the school year was normal besides my seminar teacher being a pedophile, the last quarter is honestly what really defined the school year, as the COVID-19 pandemic was such a huge event that changed absolutely everything, and it would of course be this event that caused the rest of my time in high school and even my first semester of college to be much more unusual. In part 7 and 8, we'll see just how much of an impact the COVID-19 pandemic had on my junior and senior years respectively. So yeah, that's the end of this story time, as well as part 6 of 8 of the extensive reflection project. I hope you all did enjoy this story time and be on the lookout for part 7, which will be on the summer of